Okay. It's Marlon. Hey, Marlon. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the National Governors Association. We are so thrilled to have had record participation. 48 governors have participated in some part of the National Governors Association events yesterday, today. I would add that the denominator is 55, not 50, because this includes, of course, the territories and their wonderful governors who grace us with their presence. You know, we know as governors, we're problem solvers. There's no Democratic or Republican way to fix a pothole. While each of our states is unique, has unique assets, has unique challenges, we also know that there's some shared challenges that we face together, whether it's improving our public safety, improving our roads, improving our permitting process so we can build our powerful and compelling and prosperous future. Each governor is well aware of what they need to do to move our states forward, and of course, the importance of collaboration with one another, as well as with the federal government, to make the lives of our citizens even better. As chair of the Bipartisan National Governors Association, I'm so proud to lead my bipartisan conversation and initiative on student success, about how we can better measure outcomes, how can we ensure that our students have the skills they need to thrive in today's and tomorrow's economy. Let's Get Ready, Educating All Americans for Success is really about student-level success, how can all learners thrive and succeed, but also about how we can power our economies. The number one thing we hear from employers is how can we attract and retain the people we need to power our economic success. And we know that we need to do better for the students, and we know that we need to do better for the economy, and that starts with more successfully measuring outcomes, replicating and expanding what works, and changing what doesn't work. And I'm going to sneeze one moment here.
Bless you.
Hey. Okay, I'm okay. And that's one of the many ways we're working together, building off of the Disagree Better initiative of Spencer Cox, educating all students for success. And this gathering with all of our governors from states and territories really carries on the proud tradition of working together on issues, on challenges, and to build a brighter future for the American people at the state level. States, with regard to education, are the biggest funders of education. For most of us, it's the biggest line item in our budget. And states don't run the schools. But for the money that we're investing on behalf of our taxpayers, we better make sure that we're getting the outcomes we need for our states to succeed, and we're in an excellent position to do that. I look forward to continued opportunities to deliver more efficiently and better for the people we serve, and I'll turn it over to the NGA Vice Chair, Kevin Stitt, and we'll be happy to take some questions after. Vice Chair.
Thank you so much, Governor Polis, and thanks for your leadership on something that we all agree on with all 50 governors across the country, and that is we want the best educational outcomes for our young people. So something that we can all agree on, and I think the NGA is uniquely positioned to work on some bipartisan conversations around infrastructure. It's around how the federal dollars flow to the states, and there's a lot of agreements because as chief executives of our state, we really always all want the same thing. I tell people this all the time. I said, let Washington, D.C. play politics. In Oklahoma and in Colorado, we all want the same thing. And that's the best education for our kids. We want the best economy. We want the best health care system. We want the best roads and bridges. And when we focus on getting things done at the state, it's really a unique way. And so I think that's why NGA is such an important voice to our leadership here in Washington, D.C. about how these decisions affect the states and how we can work together. So we're this meeting is so important as we all get together as governors and share different ideas, and very collaborative, and Governor Polis and I agree on much more than we disagree on, and we can also, like Governor Cox had his initiative, we can learn to disagree better and show that to Americans, how we can have honest conversation and debate about the correct policy and the right way to lead our country. And so look forward to serving, and I've enjoyed being his vice chair and championing the education policies that he's put forward, and we'll open it up to questions.
Thank you. And if you could please introduce your news outlet and yourself when you make a question. Go ahead.
Morning, Governor. This is Jessica Smith-Cross from the in Canada. There are a few Canadian reporters here this morning because we had two premiers come down to this meeting in hopes of talking to governors and getting their message across that Canada wants free trade with the United States and probably none of this more for 51st state business. Could you both weigh in on whether the premiers have been able to get that message out to you and if anybody will pass that message on to President Trump?
Well, I think the premiers have a very receptive and supportive audience with most governors. Certainly, I'm a strong supporter of free trade between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. It's absolutely critical with the geopolitical competition we face with China and across the world that the North American trading bloc work together to break down barriers, reduce tariffs, and be more competitive in the global economy. So we're excited to work more closely with our Canadian partners, and I've certainly advocated on that very issue to the administration.
You know, I support President Trump and what he's doing to get manufacturing, get jobs back to the U.S. And if he's using this as a tool, and we want to make sure that it's fair on both sides of the aisle, or we want to make sure it's fair. And we're whether it's Europe, China, I think it's important that we do get manufacturing back to the U.S. So if there's a lever that we're using right now for negotiating purposes, we stand behind the president.
Next question.
I am wondering what you believe you see as the governor's role in either cooperating or resisting the Trump administration in its crackdown on immigration through ICE raids, especially with the presence of Trinidad and other gangs like that, what you see as the governor's role.
Well, we've laid out a few areas that are really priorities for governors, and of course the president has expressed a strong interest in reforming FEMA and emergency response. Guess what? It's governors and frankly even some of our sheriffs that are running those emergencies. We want to make sure we're at the table in that. With regard to immigration, there's varying degrees of cooperation that's needed with regard to criminal investigations. I can speak for Colorado. We have a very strong relationship with the FBI, with ICE, with Homeland Security, and we see apprehending criminals regardless of whether they got here a year ago or our fourth generation as a big part of what we need to do to make Colorado safer.
You know, I set up what we're calling in Oklahoma Operation Guardian. And Operation Guardian, I put my Commissioner of Public Safety in charge to say how many people do we currently have in prison in the state of Oklahoma who are here illegally, that have committed crimes, and then how can we work with the Trump administration to get them out of our state, out of our country, and off of the taxpayer rolls in Oklahoma. So I think that's probably the first step. I think that's what the president is talking about. Let's get people that really are committing crimes out of the country, because for the last 4 years, there's been no appetite to deport criminals. And so we're thankful to have President Trump in the White House that is focused on safe communities. I think we can all agree on that. In Oklahoma, I also said, listen, we're not going to ask for immigration status for 6, 7, 8-year-old kids in school. There was a push to do that in our school system, and I said, listen, a 6, 7, 8-year-old is not a threat to is not a threat to our communities, and so let's focus on the criminal activity, and I think that's probably what the president's really talking about here. Now that we have secure borders, and day one in office, President Trump closed the southern border, and I think that's something that Oklahomans and most Americans really appreciate. We have to know who's coming into our country. And then secondly, I encourage this administration to really look at immigration policy and contracts for work, whatever type of visa, workforce visas we need. I've been an advocate for workforce visas at the state level. I think nothing better than the governors. We know what engineers we need, and matching employers with employees is something that governors should be able to do, whether it's in the construction industry, the agricultural industry, engineering, aviation, whatever our states need. Matching employers to employees in this contract for work, I think, is really important. Other countries have figured this out. We can figure this out as well. We're like the NFL with the #1 draft pick. We should be able to choose the very best and brightest to our country, but we're just being silly how we do it right now. Let's close the border. Let's make sure we have the very best and brightest that come into our country.
I just want to add what Governor Stitt, what he talked about, has a lot of support from both Democratic and Republican governors. The federal government needs to figure it out, and obviously they are the only ones with the purview over who could be a citizen someday. But at least for the provisional work permits, let the states play a role. Let us stay up. We know who we need to power our private sector. Let us be able to grant those based on clean background checks, provisional, and that'll help power our economic growth. Yes.
Gabrielle Gurley, the American Prospect. I was wondering if you could speak to what you're hearing from your business communities about Canadian tariffs, and that's part one. To part two is, to the degree that you can, what are you hearing from northern border state governors about tariffs?
Well, I think you should address one of where neither of us are northern border state governors. However, Colorado and Oklahoma have thriving trade relationships with both Canada and Mexico, so it's by no means restricted only to the states that happen to border our largest trading partners. Again, I support free trade with Canada and Mexico. I don't think any of us really know what's in the president's mind here. If this results in a place with lower tariffs and lower trade barriers, I'll be the first to compliment that. If it leads to additional tariffs, I will be the first to criticize that, because that will hurt the American people, it'll hurt manufacturing, it'll hurt exports, and it'll hurt consumers.
I'll give you a real-world example. So Oklahoma was competing for a manufacturer that was relocating to the U.S. They wanted to get into the U.S. market, coming from Europe, and we lost that to Canada. And Canada was still allowed, through a loophole, was allowed to qualify for a federal tax incentive from the federal government, whether it was IRA or the other one. But that's an unintended consequences that I don't think that Americans want their tax dollars subsidizing a plant or a manufacturing facility in Canada. We want to support American jobs, paying into our healthcare system, paying into our Social Security system. And so having American jobs is really, really important for this administration. It's important to Oklahomans. I think it's important to most Americans. And I understand there's some unintended consequences. It might affect the Canadian citizens. But when we think about taking American tax dollars and incentivizing other countries, that's where I have a problem with it. I think most Americans would have a problem with it. And I think the Trump administration has a problem with it.
Yes, go ahead.
Wayne Norton, WJYS, Chicago. Can you guys give us some takeaways from the White House meeting yesterday?
Sure. So we spent the better part of a day. The administration, in working with National Governors Association, created a very effective format where effectively we had 2 or 3 cabinet members that sat with 5 or 6 governors in half-hour blocks, and we were able to meet with them. I personally met with the Treasury Secretary, the head of the Office of OMB, Secretary Burgum, and a number, and the EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin. So others chose others, and we were able to do 2 things. One is, of course, begin to establish those relationships. Of course, some of us had prior relationships with some of them, but we were also able to get into issues that affect several states. Now, each of us have our own issues with each agency, and some of those were raised, but we often raise those in one-to-one meetings, and some governors have, and we're working on a letter. Here's, 3 pages of what we need to do with U.S. Forest Service. But certainly at a high level, the cabinet members were able to directionally share with us where they were going, and then we were able to share with them what our goals and priorities were as states, and even getting into some of the state particular goals that we have.
Yeah, we thought it was a really productive meeting. All the governors were there, and like Governor Polis said, we had different breakout sessions. We could choose which secretary we wanted to visit with. I visited with Secretary of Interior and Secretary of Energy, and I think the big picture. We also heard from the Deputy Chief of Staff from the White House, and I think the big picture was that they are open. They gave our cell phones to us. Whether it's a Republican governor or Democrat governor, they want to get stuff done. And if they have a problem, the president wants to get it fixed, and he's pushing his staff to solve the problems and get rid of the bureaucracy. So permitting, for example, is a great thing that we had a lot of conversations around, because if you're in Colorado and you're building more broadband, or you're in Oklahoma building transmission lines, or any other state that needs more electricity generation, we need to look at permitting, and things should not take longer to permit than it does to actually build the project. So I think that's a total effort by this administration. But we're really, and the president talked about energy. He talked about education, trying to get the states more flexibility. 40% of the money that flows into the states comes from the federal government. So giving the states more flexibility, whether you call that block grants or just more flexibility, I think that's something that they're really interested in doing. And then just helping us get projects done quicker to meet the needs of American citizens is a big overall focus, I think, of this administration.
Well, I think we have people who haven't asked a single question yet, so we only have time for about 3 more. Go ahead, sir.
Sure, thank you. Rob Ferguson from the Toronto Star. Just to follow up on the White House meeting question, did the border tariff issue come up in that meeting? And do you have any concerns, either of you? There's a lot of predictions, for example, that given the way auto parts flow back and forth across the border at different stages of manufacturing, that the auto industry could shut down like within a week, be severely damaged on both sides of the border. So any concerns about that?
Well, I would have concerns around any disruptions to trade myself, and as I said, I support a strong hemispheric trade bloc with free trade between U.S., Mexico, and Canada. It almost certainly came up in many of the conversations. I did raise a point with Stephen Miller. I think I'll let Kevin speak for himself. I think most of our Republican governors would agree. My point was, whatever you're doing in this area, which none of us are, sure whether it's a master negotiating strategy or we're just stabbing ourselves a bunch of times, get it done quickly here so we get the stability we need for business and investment. That was my point. So I hope that whatever that we're doing here, we figure it out in a few months, because it's a freeze on investment, whether it's factories in Canada or factories in the United States. If nobody knows what the trade and regime will look like, it delays business decision making. So I encourage them to get this done and predictable and stable with Canada and Mexico quickly. And I think he took that message back. He first defended their strategy, which wasn't what I was trying to ask about, but then he did understand that I was asking about just making sure we get it done quickly.
Go to Karen, then Caitlin, and then one more question.
Okay, Karen?
Right here, Karen Tumulty with the Washington Post.
Yeah.
Following up, too, on that meeting yesterday, what did the two of you make of the confrontation that the president sought out with the governor of Maine?
Well, as governors, our prior initiative that we continue our work on is to disagree better. We always hope that people can disagree in a way that elevates the discourse and tries to come to a common solution around what the issue is. I don't think that disagreement was necessarily a model of that. I don't think a lot of us went in really even aware of what the conflict was about. But look, if there's a conflict there, I encourage everybody to get together and work it out. Obviously, one way to do that is through the courts if it comes to that. But if there's other ways to understand where folks are coming from, I would encourage everybody to do that.
Yeah, I would just say it was a little uncomfortable in the room, but like Governor Polis said, wasn't sure exactly what the backstory was behind the conflict there. Apparently, there had been some things that both sides had said. It was probably good politics for both parties. I don't know. Maybe the governor of Maine, it was good politics for her for her constituents, but. I think most Americans, the big picture here, I totally agree with the president. I did this back in 22. I don't believe that most Americans think that boys should play in girls' sports. And so the President of the United States was duly elected by the citizens of the country, and he made a decision that he doesn't think that that's right. And, the NCAAs follow that. I think the Olympics. And then you have a governor saying that they're not going to follow that. So I don't know what legal background she has, but they talked about seeing each other in court, and we'll see what happens on it.
Well, and she did recommit. She said we're following all state and federal laws. So I without knowing much about the situation, she's a former attorney general herself, and so she was able to make it clear that they are following state and federal law in the matter.
Thank you for doing this. You mentioned permitting reform. You talked about what you want from the federal government, but how do you deal with local communities who might not want these projects in their backyard, specifically the Southwestern Grid Connector Corridor project that touches Oklahoma and Colorado? And also to follow up on the previous question, was there an NGA message to the White House about the federal funding freeze and the federal layoffs?
Well, on the first one, I think there were definitely questions raised about a few of the federal accounts that might still be frozen with different folks. I think it came up in my session with the OMB director. I think hopefully they are, and we found out there's, one of our accounts we needed was unfrozen yesterday. So again, hopefully this is occurring. There are still, to be clear, frozen accounts, and we will continue to elevate that and find out what's occurring. But yes, that was brought up in a number of different contexts. We're focused again on the national permitting. I mean, this is the issue you're raising is a very legitimate one. It's one we deal with as a state. In fact, one of our goals is making our energy grid lower cost, more resilient, and the siting of additional transmission is a key factor to do that in our state. And that means finding a more constructive way to work with local government to make sure we get it done. The federal piece, the federal government owns 36% of the state of Colorado. There are states that they own 60, 70% of, as well as required processes like NEPA for projects on public land. So that's really the focus of the discussion there. But we certainly acknowledge that we have challenges within our own states with regards to getting things done as well.
On the money that flows to the states, like I said, it's about 40% of Oklahoma's budget. It's probably similar in Colorado and other states. I applaud the president to looking at federal spending. Right now, we are spending $2 trillion over our income. That's not sustainable. Nobody borrows on their credit cards year after year after year and overspends. And so I applaud the president, DOGE, to looking at government efficiency. I set up DOGE Oklahoma to give the president and Elon and that agency some information from Oklahoma's perspective that if you need to cut 10% from the funding to the states, here's how Oklahoma can do it without cutting core services. If you need to cut 20% from the states, here's how we think we can do it. If you plan this out over the next 4 or 5 years, we think we can absorb that. If you extrapolate that over all 50 states, here's where you can come up with part of the savings. Versus a top-down approach, I think the states need to be involved. The states created the federal government, not the other way around. And so I think from a federalism perspective, the state should have a seat at the table. And I think that's part of the governor's agreement that we can help with some of these decisions that they're doing. But I applaud the overall initiative because we need to have a balanced budget. States balance their budget. Colorado has a balanced budget. Oklahoma has a balanced budget. And if you think about this, back in 2020, if we would freeze the federal spending, today we would have a balanced budget. But unfortunately, we continue to spend and overspend and overspend. Our revenue is going up. Let's slow the growth of government. Let's look at some of these inefficiencies. The things that they're finding, I think most Americans find it atrocious that we're borrowing money to do humanitarian efforts all over the world, which I'm not saying they're not important, but nobody in this room puts money on their credit card at the end of the year and says, hey, I'm going to max out my credit card to donate to this charity. You don't do that. And that's what we're doing as a country. So I applaud the president for everything he's doing and to make sure that we are getting our fiscal house in order.
I like that reminder that it was the states that got together to establish the federal government. So we hope they don't forget that. Final question, somebody who hasn't asked one before. Let's go to the back over there. Yes.
Hi, Lisa Kaczynski from Politico. Given the exchange with the Maine governor and all of your meetings yesterday with the various administration officials, do you get the sense that President Trump and his administration are willing to work with Democratic governors on a broad range of issues, or do you anticipate this being a more adversarial relationship?
Well, a lot of the work of the National Governors Association, for instance, on permitting reform, it predates the Biden administration. We worked with President Trump, President Biden, predates the Trump administration. We worked with President Biden on the same issue. President Biden was committed to permitting reform. There were bills that didn't quite make it. We're continuing that work. And don't tell President Trump, but I think he actually agrees with President Biden on this. We don't want him to switch his opinion now that he knows. But both President Biden and President Trump have directionally wanted to work with the governors on making it easier to build things and removing barriers, and we certainly hope that this administration is a success. Now, there's other issues where they don't agree, of course. Governors have a very practical and pragmatic relationship with the federal government. We rely on them for many things. Governor Stitt mentioned the funding, but there's also laws we live under. There's public lands. There's federal law enforcement. So it's a very complicated relationship, and we have to have a functional way to work with the federal government in each area. There's always things the federal government will do that we disagree with and things that we agree with. But the importance of that relationship between the states and the federal government is elevated, and it's very important that any White House have an open door to talk to states and governors on the ground who are implementing policy.
Yeah, and the president himself said, he said, listen, if a Democrat governor calls me, he goes, if they call me at the same time, I don't know if he's making a joke, but he said, if a Democrat governor and a Republican governor call me at the same time, I'm going to take the Democrat governor's call first. And
the problem is we don't all have his numbers, so that's the only problem. You guys do.
But he said, listen, we're here to help. And then Steve Miller, the deputy chief of staff, gave his personal cell number to all the Democrat governors, the Republican governors, and said, please reach out to us. The president expects us to get stuff done. That's the main message here. He is a businessman. He is not ideological. He wants to get things done. He wants to cut through the bureaucracy. Over 250 years of our country's history, agencies, there's mission creep. We're getting into stuff that was never passed by Congress, but it's all by rulemaking, and it's just ground to a halt innovation, and that is the biggest problem in our country right now. And I think we should all agree on that. Let's get rid of some of the bureaucracy, because it's the states that educate our kids, build schools, build roads and bridges, and execute on the health care of our citizens. It's not the federal government. The federal government is a big bureaucracy that needs to be checked and put back in size, and we need that money flowing back to the states where actually we get things done. And so I think that's the big message, and I think the president agrees with us, and I think most governors agree with us on that.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Appreciate your interest, and we look forward to seeing you at the next few sessions of National Governors Association.
Thank you.
Thank you.